Zebulon Montgomery Pike was an American explorer and military officer who blazed trails across the uncharted western territories of a young United States. Zebulon Pike, whose expeditions would help map the vast Louisiana Purchase, was born in Lamberton, New Jersey on January 5, 1779. He came from a military family, his father having served as an officer in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Pike had a determined spirit and an adventurous nature. His education was limited, as frontier life demanded practical skills over formal schooling. He joined the military at the young age of 15, following in his father's footsteps as a cadet in 1794. The boy soldier would spend his formative years learning the discipline and tactics that would define his career. Pike rose through the ranks steadily, demonstrating leadership qualities that his superiors recognized and valued. In 1799, at just 20 years old, Pike received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He was stationed at various frontier posts along the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region. These assignments exposed him to the challenges of maintaining order in territories where American authority was still being established. Pike married Clarissa Brown in 1801, and she would remain a devoted partner throughout his military career, enduring long separations as duty called him to distant frontiers. The young officer distinguished himself through his dedication to his men and his meticulous attention to detail in carrying out orders. By 1805, the United States had completed the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring an enormous swath of territory from France that doubled the size of the nation. President Thomas Jefferson was eager to explore and map this vast wilderness. While Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were conducting their famous expedition to the Pacific Northwest, the government needed additional explorations of other regions within the Louisiana Territory. General James Wilkinson, the governor of the Louisiana Territory and commanding general of the Army, selected Lieutenant Zebulon Pike for a crucial mission. Pike was ordered to find the source of the Mississippi River and to assert American sovereignty over the northern reaches of the new territory. In August 1805, Pike departed from St. Louis with a small party of 20 men in a 70-foot keelboat. The expedition faced the Mississippi River's strong currents as they pushed northward into unknown country. Pike and his men traveled through the heat of late summer and into the bitter cold of autumn. They passed through territories inhabited by various Native American tribes, and Pike made efforts to establish peaceful relations and gather intelligence about the lands ahead. The expedition built a small fort near present-day Little Falls, Minnesota, where they spent a harsh winter. The temperatures plummeted far below zero, and several men suffered from frostbite and exposure. Pike himself endured these hardships alongside his men, demonstrating the leadership through shared sacrifice that would characterize his career. Pike believed he had found the source of the Mississippi River at Leech Lake, though later explorations would prove the actual source lay further upstream at Lake Itasca. Despite this geographical error, the expedition succeeded in mapping large portions of the upper Mississippi and establishing American presence in a region where British and French-Canadian traders had previously dominated. Pike negotiated with Native American leaders and purchased land for future military posts. He returned to St. Louis in April 1806, having lost no men despite the extreme conditions. The expedition had covered approximately 5,000 miles in 8 months, a remarkable achievement given the primitive conditions and the severity of the winter they endured. Pike had little time to rest before General Wilkinson assigned him another, even more ambitious mission. In July 1806, just 3 months after returning from the Mississippi expedition, Pike was ordered to explore the southwestern portion of the Louisiana Purchase. His official instructions were to escort a group of Osage Indians back to their homeland, to make contact with the Comanche tribes, and to explore the headwaters of the Arkansas and Red Rivers. There were also secret orders, the exact nature of which remains debated by historians to this day. Some believe Pike was instructed to gather intelligence on Spanish military positions in the southwest, as tensions between the United States and Spain over the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase were running high. Pike's southwestern expedition departed from Fort Bellefontaine near St. Louis on July 15, 1806 with a party of 23 men. They traveled across the Great Plains, through lands that would become Kansas and Nebraska. The vast prairies stretched endlessly in every direction, and Pike marveled at the enormous herds of buffalo that darkened the plains. The expedition made contact with the Pawnee Indians, who informed Pike that a Spanish military force had recently passed through the region searching for the American explorers. The Spanish authorities viewed Pike's expedition with suspicion, believing it was a reconnaissance mission preparing for American expansion into Spanish territory. As autumn turned to winter, Pike pushed his expedition westward toward the Rocky Mountains. In November 1806, Pike and his men caught their first glimpse of the majestic peak that would later bear his name. Pike's Peak, rising over 14,000 feet above sea level, dominated the horizon. Pike attempted to climb the mountain but was turned back by deep snow, bitter cold, and the sheer difficulty of the ascent. He famously wrote in his journal that he believed the peak would never be climbed, though later mountaineers would prove him wrong. The mountain that defeated him would become his most enduring legacy, a landmark known to millions of Americans who would later travel westward. Pike led his men southward along the front range of the Rockies, searching for the headwaters of the Red River. The winter of 1806 to 1807 was brutally cold, and the expedition was poorly equipped for mountain travel in such conditions. The men's clothing was inadequate, their supplies were running low, and several suffered from frostbite so severe that their feet froze solid. Pike ordered a small stockade built in the San Luis Valley, in what is now southern Colorado. The expedition was exhausted, starving, and desperate. Some historians believe Pike deliberately built his fort on Spanish territory, hoping to be captured and taken to Santa Fe where he could gather intelligence. Others argue that Pike genuinely believed he was still within American territory, as the maps of the region were extremely inaccurate. In February 1807, Spanish soldiers arrived at Pike's stockade and informed him that he was trespassing on Spanish soil. Pike expressed surprise at this news, though whether his surprise was genuine remains a matter of historical debate. The Spanish commander treated Pike courteously but insisted that he and his men accompany the Spanish soldiers to Santa Fe for questioning. Pike agreed, having little choice in the matter given his men's weakened condition and the overwhelming Spanish force. The journey to Santa Fe took several weeks, and along the way Pike carefully observed the Spanish settlements, military installations, and the geography of the region. He took extensive notes, though the Spanish would later confiscate his papers. In Santa Fe, Pike was interrogated by Spanish officials who suspected him of espionage. Pike maintained that he had simply become lost while searching for the Red River and had inadvertently crossed into Spanish territory. The Spanish governor, Joaquin del Real Alencaster, was skeptical but treated Pike with the courtesy due to an officer and a gentleman. Pike was held in Santa Fe for several weeks while the Spanish authorities decided what to do with him. During this time, Pike gathered valuable intelligence about Spanish military strength, the layout of Santa Fe, and the attitudes of the local population toward Spanish rule. Many of the inhabitants were unhappy with Spanish administration and expressed interest in trade with the Americans. Eventually, the Spanish decided to escort Pike and his men back to American territory rather than hold them as prisoners. The route took them through Chihuahua deep into the interior of New Spain, before turning eastward toward Louisiana. This journey, though conducted under guard, allowed Pike to observe vast stretches of Spanish territory that few Americans had ever seen. He noted the locations of mines, the strength of military garrisons, and the economic conditions of the various provinces. When the Spanish finally released Pike at the Louisiana border in July 1807, they returned most of his men but kept his papers, maps, and journals. However, Pike had memorized much of what he had observed and had hidden some notes in the rifle barrels of his men. Pike returned to American territory after nearly a year in Spanish custody. His expedition had covered approximately 8,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. He had lost several men to the harsh conditions, and others had suffered permanent disabilities from frostbite. Yet Pike had succeeded in gathering an enormous amount of information about the Southwest. He immediately began writing an account of his expeditions, working from memory and the notes he had managed to conceal from the Spanish. His report described the geography, climate, natural resources, and inhabitants of the regions he had explored. Pike's account of his expeditions was published in 1810 under the title An Account of Expeditions to the Sources of the Mississippi and Through the Western Parts of Louisiana. The book became a bestseller and was translated into several European languages. Pike described the Great Plains as a vast desert unsuitable for agriculture, an assessment that would influence American perceptions of the region for decades. He called it the Great American Desert, a characterization that discouraged settlement of the plains for many years. This assessment would later prove incorrect as farmers learned to adapt their techniques to the prairie environment, but in Pike's time, his observations seemed accurate. Pike's descriptions of the Spanish territories in the Southwest were particularly valuable to American policymakers and merchants. He detailed the weakness of Spanish military forces, the dissatisfaction of the local population, and the opportunities for trade. His reports contributed to growing American interest in expansion toward the Pacific and influenced the political debates over the future of the continent. Some historians believe Pike's intelligence gathering was a factor in the eventual American acquisition of the Southwest, though this occurred decades after his death. General James Wilkinson, Pike's sponsor and commander, was later revealed to have been involved in various conspiracies, including a plot with Aaron Burr to establish an independent nation in the Southwest. Wilkinson was also suspected of being a paid agent of Spain. These revelations cast a shadow over Pike's expeditions, and some historians have questioned whether Pike was an unwitting pawn in Wilkinson's schemes or a willing participant in espionage activities. Pike always maintained his innocence of any conspiracy and insisted that his actions were motivated solely by patriotism and duty to his country. Most modern historians believe Pike was honest in his claims and that he was simply following orders without full knowledge of any hidden agendas his superiors might have had. Pike continued his military career after returning from the Southwest. He was promoted to captain and later to major, serving at various frontier posts. He wrote military treatises and worked to improve the training and discipline of American forces. Pike was a serious student of military science, studying the campaigns of Napoleon and other great commanders. He believed strongly in the importance of professional military education and rigorous training. Pike advocated for the establishment of a military academy system that would produce officers trained in modern warfare techniques. When the War of 1812 broke out between the United States and Great Britain, Pike was promoted to brigadier general. He was given command of troops in the northern frontier, where American forces were preparing to invade Canada. Pike was eager to prove himself in conventional warfare after spending years on exploration and frontier duty. He trained his men intensively, instilling discipline and preparing them for the coming campaign. Pike was a demanding commander but one who led by example and shared the hardships of his soldiers. In April 1813, American forces launched an attack on York, the capital of Upper Canada and present-day Toronto. General Pike led 1,500 men in an amphibious assault on the town. The American forces landed successfully and began advancing against British and Canadian defenders. Pike personally led his men forward, exposing himself to enemy fire as he directed the attack. The British forces, realizing they could not hold the town, began to retreat. As they withdrew, they set fire to their ammunition magazine to prevent it from falling into American hands. The explosion was massive and unexpected. A huge quantity of gunpowder and ammunition detonated with tremendous force, sending debris flying in all directions. Rocks, timber, and metal fragments rained down on the American forces who had just captured the position. General Zebulon Pike was struck by a large stone that crushed his spine. He was carried from the battlefield, mortally wounded, as his men secured the town. Pike remained conscious for several hours after being wounded. He was told that the British flag had been captured and lowered, and he asked that it be placed under his head as he lay dying. Pike expressed satisfaction that the battle had been won and that his men had performed well. Zebulon Montgomery Pike died on April 27, 1813, at the age of 34. He had spent nearly his entire adult life in military service to his country. Pike was buried with full military honors, and his death was mourned throughout the nation. He was remembered as a brave officer who had explored unknown territories and who had died leading his men in battle. Pike left behind his wife Clarissa and several children. His family struggled financially after his death, as military pensions were inadequate and Pike had accumulated debts during his years of service on the frontier. Pike's legacy as an explorer was initially overshadowed by the more famous Lewis and Clark expedition, which had captured the public imagination with its journey to the Pacific Ocean. However, Pike's contributions to American expansion were significant. He provided the first detailed descriptions of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains for American audiences. His reports on the Southwest gave American leaders crucial intelligence about Spanish territories and influenced future expansion policies. The mountain that bears his name became one of the most recognizable landmarks in the American West, a symbol of the frontier spirit and westward expansion. Pike's expeditions helped establish American claims to the vast territories of the Louisiana Purchase. His interactions with Native American tribes and his observations of Spanish settlements provided valuable information for future diplomats and military planners. Pike demonstrated the courage and determination that characterized the generation of Americans who pushed the boundaries of their young nation ever westward. He explored regions that would later become some of the most important states in the American Union, including Minnesota, Colorado, Kansas, and New Mexico. The city of Pikes Peak, Colorado Springs, and numerous other geographic features across the West bear Pike's name, testament to his enduring impact on American geography and history. Pike was a complex figure, a military officer who served his country faithfully but who also operated in a murky world of frontier politics and international intrigue. He was an explorer who made significant discoveries but also significant errors in his geographical assessments. He was a leader who inspired loyalty in his men but who also drove them through terrible hardships in pursuit of his objectives. Zebulon Pike represented the spirit of early 19th century America, a nation eager to explore and claim the vast territories of the continent, willing to take risks and endure hardships in pursuit of national expansion. He was a product of his time, shaped by the values of military honor, patriotic duty, and manifest destiny that drove American expansion westward. Pike's relatively short life was packed with adventure, hardship, and achievement. From his teenage enlistment in the army to his death on a Canadian battlefield, Pike devoted himself to military service and to expanding American knowledge of the continent. His expeditions, though less celebrated than those of Lewis and Clark, were crucial to American understanding of the Louisiana Purchase territories. His military leadership, though cut short by his early death, demonstrated the qualities of courage and dedication that the young American military needed in its conflicts with European powers. Pike was in many ways a typical American officer of his era, ambitious, patriotic, and willing to endure great hardships in service to his country. Yet he was also exceptional in his determination, his leadership abilities, and his willingness to venture into unknown territories with inadequate resources and support. Zebulon Montgomery Pike died as he had lived, in service to his country and leading his men in difficult circumstances. His death at York was mourned as the loss of a promising young general who might have achieved even greater things had he lived. His legacy as an explorer and military officer endures, commemorated in the names of mountains, cities, and counties across the American West. Pike was even in death a symbol of American courage and the spirit of exploration that drove the young nation to expand across the continent, claiming territories and establishing the boundaries that would define the United States for generations to come. Kit Carson was a frontier legend and a complex figure who became one of the most famous mountain men in American history. Kit Carson, the legendary scout and Indian agent, was born in Madison County, Kentucky on December 24, 1809. He came from a humble frontier family. He had a small, wiry frame that belied his toughness. Carson's early years were spent on the edge of civilization. He received almost no formal education, remaining illiterate for much of his early life. When he was just 9 years old, his father died in a tragic accident, and the young Carson was left to help support his large family. Then in 1826, the 16-year-old Carson ran away from his apprenticeship to a saddle maker and headed west on the Santa Fe Trail, seeking adventure and opportunity in the vast unexplored territories beyond the Mississippi River. Kit Carson was a man of the wilderness. He spent his formative years learning the ways of the frontier. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, Carson became a mountain man, trapping beaver in the Rocky Mountains and learning to survive in some of the harshest terrain on the continent. He was small in stature, standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall, but he possessed extraordinary courage and skills that made him a respected figure among the trappers and traders of the West. Carson was not a boastful man. He spoke quietly and carried himself with humility, yet his reputation grew with each passing season in the mountains. The Mountain Man era was a brutal and demanding time. Carson trapped beaver along icy streams, fought off grizzly bears, and survived winters that killed lesser men. He learned multiple Native American languages and customs, developing relationships with various tribes. In 1835, Carson attended the famous rendezvous at Green River, where mountain men from across the West gathered to trade furs, share stories, and celebrate their survival of another year in the wilderness. It was at these gatherings that Carson's reputation as a skilled hunter and fighter began to spread throughout the frontier. Carson married twice to Native American women during his mountain man years. His first wife was an Arapaho woman named Juanibe, who died shortly after giving birth to their daughter. His second wife was a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road. These marriages reflected Carson's deep integration into Native American culture and his understanding of indigenous ways of life. However, both marriages ended, and Carson would later marry a third time to a Hispanic woman from New Mexico, demonstrating his ability to move between different cultural worlds on the frontier. By the early 1840s, the beaver trade was declining, and Carson needed to find new ways to make a living on the frontier. In 1842, Carson's life took a dramatic turn when he met John C. Fremont on a steamboat traveling up the Missouri River. Fremont was a young Army officer leading an expedition to map the Oregon Trail, and he needed an experienced guide who knew the Western Territories. Carson was hired on the spot, and this partnership would transform him from an obscure mountain man into a national celebrity. Carson guided Fremont on 3 major expeditions between 1842 and 1846. These expeditions mapped vast portions of the American West, from the Rocky Mountains to California. Fremont's published reports of these journeys portrayed Carson as the ideal frontiersman, brave, resourceful, skilled in wilderness survival, and deadly with a rifle. The reports were widely read in the eastern states, where Americans were hungry for stories about the mysterious lands beyond the frontier. Kit Carson became a household name, the embodiment of the Western hero in the American imagination. The image that Fremont created of Carson was somewhat romanticized. Fremont needed a heroic figure to populate his narratives, and Carson fit the role perfectly. In reality, Carson was more complex than the dime novel hero he became. He was pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, and capable of violence when he deemed it necessary. But he was also known for his word being his bond, his loyalty to friends, and his willingness to help those in need on the frontier. When the Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, Carson found himself in the thick of the action. He was in California with Fremont when the Bear Flag Revolt began, and he participated in the American conquest of California. Carson served as a courier, carrying dispatches across dangerous territory from California to Washington. On one famous journey, he traveled from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., covering thousands of miles through hostile territory. His service during the war further enhanced his reputation as a fearless scout and patriot. After the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, Carson settled in Taos, New Mexico with his third wife, Josefa Jaramillo, whom he had married in 1843. Josefa came from a prominent Hispanic family in Taos, and the marriage brought Carson into the upper levels of New Mexican society. They would have 8 children together, though several died in infancy, a common tragedy on the frontier. Carson attempted to settle into a quieter life, trying his hand at ranching and farming in the Taos area. But Carson could not stay away from frontier life for long. In 1853, he was appointed Indian agent for the Ute and Apache tribes in northern New Mexico. This position placed Carson in a difficult and contradictory role. He was tasked with representing the interests of the United States government to Native American tribes, many of whom were facing increasing pressure from American expansion. Carson spoke several native languages, had lived among various tribes, and had married native women. He understood indigenous cultures better than most government officials. Yet he was also an instrument of American policy that was systematically dispossessing native peoples of their lands. As Indian agent, Carson tried to walk a fine line. He advocated for fair treatment of the tribes under his supervision, arguing that the government should honor its treaty obligations and provide promised supplies and support. He believed that Native Americans needed to adapt to the changing world by adopting agriculture and settling on reservations, a view that reflected the paternalistic attitudes of his time. Carson genuinely believed he was helping native people survive in a world that was rapidly changing around them. However, his role as Indian agent also required him to enforce government policies that restricted native freedom and autonomy. The contradictions in Carson's position became more pronounced as tensions between Native Americans and American settlers increased during the 1850s. Carson found himself mediating disputes, tracking down raiders, and trying to prevent conflicts from escalating into full-scale wars. He was respected by many Native leaders who knew him personally, but he was also seen as a representative of the government that was taking their lands and destroying their way of life. When the Civil War began in 1861, Carson resigned his position as Indian agent and accepted a commission as a colonel in the New Mexico Volunteers. New Mexico was a strategic territory, and there were concerns that Confederate forces from Texas might attempt to seize it. Carson organized a regiment of volunteers, mostly Hispanic New Mexicans, and prepared to defend the territory. In 1862, Carson's regiment participated in the Battle of Valverde against Confederate forces. Though the Union forces were initially pushed back, the Confederate invasion of New Mexico ultimately failed, and Carson's service during this period demonstrated his loyalty to the Union cause. Following his service against the Confederates, Carson was ordered to deal with Native American resistance in New Mexico and Arizona. The most controversial chapter of Carson's life was about to begin. In 1863, Carson was ordered to force the Mescalero Apache onto a reservation at Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. Carson conducted a military campaign against the Mescalero, destroying their camps and food supplies until they agreed to relocate to the reservation. The campaign was successful from a military standpoint, but it marked the beginning of a tragic policy that would have devastating consequences for Native peoples. The most infamous episode of Carson's military career came in 1864 when he was ordered to subdue the Navajo people and force them onto the Bosque Redondo reservation. The Navajo had been resisting American encroachment for years, and military officials decided that the entire tribe needed to be removed from their traditional homeland in northeastern Arizona and northwestern New Mexico. Carson was given command of the operation that would become known as the Long Walk of the Navajo. Carson's campaign against the Navajo was systematic and brutal. Rather than engaging in direct combat, Carson employed a scorched earth strategy. His troops destroyed Navajo crops, burned their homes, cut down their peach orchards, and killed their livestock. The goal was to starve the Navajo into submission by destroying their ability to survive in their homeland. The strategy worked. Facing starvation and exposure during the winter of 1863 to 1864, thousands of Navajo surrendered to American forces. In early 1864, approximately 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forced to walk over 300 miles from their homeland to Bosque Redondo. The journey, conducted in the middle of winter, was a death march. Hundreds died along the way from cold, hunger, and disease. Those who were too weak to continue were often left behind or shot. The survivors arrived at Bosque Redondo to find a barren reservation that could not support the population forced to live there. Over the next 4 years, thousands more Navajo would die from disease, starvation, and despair at Bosque Redondo. Carson's role in the Long Walk remains deeply controversial. He was following orders from his superiors, particularly General James Carleton, who designed the policy of removal and concentration. Carson had objected to some aspects of the campaign, particularly the decision to send the Navajo to Bosque Redondo, which he believed was unsuitable for supporting such a large population. However, he carried out his orders with military efficiency. For the Navajo people, Carson became a symbol of betrayal and suffering. The man who had lived among native peoples and claimed to understand them had become the instrument of their destruction. After the Navajo campaign, Carson continued his military service. In November 1864, he led a force against a large encampment of Kiowa and Comanche at Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle. Carson's force of approximately 400 men encountered an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 native warriors. In the ensuing battle, Carson's troops were nearly overwhelmed, and only the use of 2 mountain howitzers allowed them to fight their way out of the engagement. It was one of the largest battles between the U.S. Army and Plains Indians, and Carson's forces suffered significant casualties before managing to retreat. The battle at Adobe Walls demonstrated that Carson was not invincible and that native peoples were capable of mounting formidable resistance when their homelands were threatened. By 1865, Carson's health was failing. Years of hard living on the frontier had taken their toll. He suffered from an aneurysm and other ailments that caused him chronic pain. He was promoted to brevet brigadier general in recognition of his military service, but he was ready to retire from active duty. Carson resigned his commission in 1867 and returned to his family in Colorado, where they had moved to a ranch near present-day Denver. In his final years, Carson was a living legend. Dime novels had made him one of the most famous men in America, though the stories bore little resemblance to his actual life. The fictional Kit Carson was a superhuman hero who single-handedly fought off hundreds of Indians, rescued countless damsels in distress, and never lost a fight. The real Kit Carson was a small, soft-spoken man who could barely read and who suffered from chronic health problems. He found the dime novel versions of his life amusing and embarrassing in equal measure. Carson made one final trip to Washington, D.C. in 1868, traveling east to meet with government officials about Indian policy. He was received as a hero, feted at dinners and receptions. But Carson was dying, and he knew it. He returned to Colorado, where his beloved wife Josefa died shortly after giving birth to their 8th child in April 1868. Carson was devastated by her death. He had been married to Josefa for 25 years, and she was the love of his life. On May 23, 1868, just 1 month after Josefa's death, Kit Carson died at Fort Leon, Colorado. He was only 58 years old, but he had lived several lifetimes' worth of adventure and experience. His last words were reported to be "Adios, compadre," spoken to the doctor attending him. Carson was buried next to Josefa in Taos, New Mexico, returning to the place that had been his home for much of his adult life. Kit Carson's legacy is deeply complicated. In his own time and for generations afterward, he was celebrated as a hero of Western expansion, a brave scout who helped open the frontier for American settlement. Countless books, movies, and television shows portrayed him as the ideal frontiersman, embodying courage, resourcefulness, and frontier justice. Towns, counties, and landmarks across the West were named in his honor. He became a symbol of manifest destiny and American conquest of the West. However, modern perspectives on Carson are much more critical. His role in the forced removal of the Navajo and the suffering inflicted during the Long Walk cannot be excused or ignored. For the Navajo people, Carson is not a hero but a villain, the man who destroyed their homeland and caused immeasurable suffering to their ancestors. The scorched earth tactics he employed and the death march he oversaw represent some of the darkest chapters in American history. Carson's actions were part of a broader pattern of genocide and ethnic cleansing directed against Native American peoples throughout the 19th century. The contradictions in Carson's life reflect the contradictions of the American frontier itself. He was a man who lived among Native peoples, learned their languages, married Native women, and claimed to respect their cultures. Yet he also participated in military campaigns that destroyed those same peoples and cultures. He was capable of great kindness and loyalty to individuals, yet he carried out policies that caused mass suffering. He was a product of his time, shaped by the attitudes and assumptions of 19th century America, yet he was also an individual who made choices and must be held accountable for those choices. Carson's relationship with Native Americans was complex and cannot be reduced to simple categories. He had genuine friendships with individual Native people and showed respect for their skills and knowledge. He advocated for fair treatment of tribes under his supervision as Indian agent and sometimes criticized government policies he believed were unjust or impractical. Yet he also believed that Native peoples needed to abandon their traditional ways of life and assimilate into American society. He saw military force as a legitimate tool for achieving this goal, and he was willing to use brutal tactics to compel Native compliance with government demands. Some historians have argued that Carson was simply a soldier following orders and that the blame for the Long Walk and other atrocities should rest with the military and political leaders who designed these policies. There is some truth to this argument. Carson did not create the policy of removing the Navajo to Bosque Redondo, and he did express doubts about whether the plan would work. However, Carson was not a mindless instrument. He was an experienced frontiersman who understood the consequences of his actions. He chose to carry out orders that he knew would cause tremendous suffering. He bears personal responsibility for his role in these events, even as we recognize the broader context of American expansion and government policy. The debate over Carson's legacy continues today. In recent years, there have been efforts to remove his name from schools, monuments, and other public places, particularly in areas with significant Native American populations. These efforts reflect a growing recognition that the heroes of American expansion were often the villains of Native American history. At the same time, some defenders of Carson argue that he should be judged by the standards of his own time rather than modern standards, and that his positive qualities and contributions should not be entirely erased from memory. Perhaps the most accurate assessment of Kit Carson is that he was a man of his time who embodied both the best and worst qualities of the American frontier. He was brave, skilled, loyal to his friends, and capable of surviving in the harshest conditions. He was also willing to use violence to achieve his goals, participated in the dispossession of native peoples, and carried out military campaigns that caused immense suffering. He was neither the superhero of the dime novels nor a simple villain. He was a complex human being whose life reflected the moral ambiguities and contradictions of American westward expansion. Kit Carson's story is ultimately a story about America itself. His life spanned a crucial period in American history when the nation was expanding westward, displacing indigenous peoples, and establishing control over vast new territories. Carson was both an agent and a symbol of this expansion. Understanding his life requires grappling with difficult questions about conquest, cultural destruction, and the costs of building a nation. His legacy challenges us to think critically about American history and to recognize that the stories we tell about our past are often more complicated and troubling than we might wish them to be. Kit Carson was a man who lived on the edge of civilization, navigating between different worlds and cultures, ultimately serving the interests of American expansion even as he maintained personal relationships across cultural boundaries. In death as in life, he remains a controversial and contested figure, a reminder that history is never simple and that the heroes of one people may be the villains of another. Brigham Young was a Vermont farm boy and a devoted religious leader who became the Moses of the Mormon people. Brigham Young, the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was born in Whitingham, Vermont on June 1, 1801. He came from a humble family. He had a commanding presence. Young's early years were marked by poverty and hardship. He received only 11 days of formal schooling in his entire life. When he was 14 years old, his mother died, leaving young Brigham to help raise his younger siblings while working on the family farm. The Young family moved frequently, seeking better opportunities in the frontier territories of New York State. Brigham learned carpentry, painting, and glazing, becoming a skilled craftsman and tradesman. In 1824, at the age of 23, Brigham Young married Miriam Works. They settled in western New York where he worked as a carpenter and joiner, building homes and furniture. Young was searching for religious truth during a time of great spiritual awakening in America. The region where he lived was called the Burned-Over District because of the intense religious revivals that swept through it like wildfire. Brigham Young was skeptical of the emotional excesses he witnessed at revival meetings. He wanted something more substantial, something that spoke to both his mind and his heart. In 1830, Brigham Young first encountered the Book of Mormon. A copy of the book was brought to his home by his brother Phineas, who had already joined the new religious movement. Brigham studied the book carefully for 2 years before making his decision. He was methodical and deliberate in all things. He examined the claims of Joseph Smith, the young prophet who said he had translated the book from golden plates revealed to him by an angel. Young was not one to be swept away by enthusiasm or emotion. He investigated thoroughly, and in April 1832, at the age of 30, Brigham Young was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Young's conversion came at a terrible personal cost. Just weeks after his baptism, his wife Miriam died from tuberculosis, leaving him alone with 2 young daughters. Despite his grief, Brigham Young threw himself into missionary work for his new faith. He traveled throughout the northeastern states, preaching the Mormon message and gaining converts. He was a natural leader and organizer. His practical skills and steady temperament made him invaluable to the growing church. In 1835, Young was called to be one of the 12 apostles, the governing body of the church under Joseph Smith. Brigham Young met Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio, and the two men formed a deep bond of friendship and religious devotion. Young became one of Smith's most trusted lieutenants. He led missionary expeditions to England, bringing thousands of converts back to America. He oversaw the construction of temples and the establishment of new Mormon settlements. Young was utterly devoted to Joseph Smith, whom he regarded as a prophet of God. He defended Smith against critics and enemies. He followed Smith's teachings without question, including the controversial practice of plural marriage. The Mormons faced intense persecution wherever they settled. In Missouri, mobs attacked Mormon settlements, burning homes and driving families into the wilderness. The governor of Missouri issued an extermination order, declaring that the Mormons must be driven from the state or eliminated. The Mormons fled to Illinois, where they built the city of Nauvoo on a swamp along the Mississippi River. Under Joseph Smith's leadership, Nauvoo grew rapidly, becoming one of the largest cities in Illinois. Brigham Young supervised much of the construction, organizing work crews and managing resources. But the persecution followed them to Illinois. Joseph Smith's claims to prophetic authority, his practice of plural marriage, and his political ambitions made him enemies. In June 1844, a mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, where Joseph Smith was being held on charges of treason. The mob murdered Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. The Mormon people were left without their prophet. They were sheep without a shepherd, vulnerable and afraid. Several men claimed the right to succeed Joseph Smith as leader of the church. There was confusion and division among the Mormon people. Brigham Young was in Boston on a missionary journey when he received news of Joseph Smith's death. He rushed back to Nauvoo. When he arrived, he found the church in crisis. Some wanted to follow Joseph Smith's son. Others supported Sidney Rigdon, who had been Smith's counselor. But when Brigham Young stood before the assembled Mormons and began to speak, witnesses later said that something remarkable happened. They said his voice changed and became like Joseph Smith's voice. They said his face was transfigured and looked like Joseph Smith's face. Whether this was literal truth or the product of grief and hope and desperate need, the effect was undeniable. The Mormon people accepted Brigham Young as their new leader. Young moved quickly to consolidate his authority. He was elected president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and through that body he governed the church. He was not Joseph Smith. He did not claim to receive the constant stream of revelations that Smith had received. Young was a practical man, an organizer, and administrator. He was concerned with the survival of the Mormon people in a hostile world. He understood that they could not remain in Nauvoo. The persecution would continue. The state of Illinois was turning against them. Mobs were attacking outlying Mormon settlements. Young made the momentous decision that would define his legacy. The Mormons would leave the United States entirely. They would go west, into the wilderness, beyond the reach of their enemies. In February 1846, in the dead of winter, the first wagons of Mormon refugees crossed the frozen Mississippi River, leaving Nauvoo behind. It was an exodus of biblical proportions. 15,000 men, women, and children abandoned their homes and their city and set out into the unknown wilderness. They called Brigham Young their Moses, leading them to a promised land. Young organized the exodus with military precision. He divided the refugees into companies, each with a captain. He established way stations along the trail where later companies could find supplies and rest. He sent advance parties ahead to scout the route and plant crops. The journey was brutal beyond imagining. The Mormon pioneers crossed the Great Plains in covered wagons pulled by oxen. They endured blizzards and floods, disease and starvation. Children were born on the trail. Old people died and were buried in unmarked graves. The wagons broke down. The oxen died. Families ran out of food and ate whatever they could find. Some walked the entire distance barefoot because their shoes had worn out. Brigham Young drove them forward relentlessly. He would not allow them to give up. He would not allow them to turn back. He promised them that God would lead them to a place of safety and refuge. In July 1847, Brigham Young led an advance party of pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley. Young was sick with mountain fever when they arrived, lying in the back of a wagon. But when he saw the valley spread out before him, surrounded by mountains, he knew this was the place. The valley was a desert, barren and dry. Nothing grew there except sagebrush. There were no trees. The soil was alkaline. Most people would have looked at the desolate landscape and seen only death. Brigham Young saw possibility. He saw water in the mountains. He saw land that could be irrigated. He saw a place so remote and uninviting that no one else would want it, and therefore a place where the Mormons could finally be left in peace. Young immediately began organizing the settlement. He laid out the streets of Salt Lake City in a grid pattern, wide enough for a wagon to turn around. He assigned plots of land to families. He organized work parties to dig irrigation ditches, bringing water from the mountain streams to the desert floor. He sent expeditions to explore the surrounding territory. Within months, the Mormons had planted crops and built homes. More wagon trains arrived throughout the summer and fall, bringing thousands more refugees from Nauvoo. The first winter was desperate. The crops failed. The settlers had arrived too late in the season to plant successfully. Food was scarce. They ate roots and hides. They killed their cattle and rationed the meat. Some wanted to leave, to go to California where gold had been discovered. Brigham Young forbade it. He told them that if they left for the gold fields, they would lose their souls. He kept the community together through the force of his will and his unshakable faith that God had led them to this place. In the spring, they planted again, and this time the crops grew. The irrigation system worked. The desert began to bloom. Brigham Young sent missionaries back east and to Europe, calling the Mormon people to gather in Zion. Thousands responded, making the long journey across the plains. Young organized the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, which loaned money to poor converts so they could afford the journey. He expected them to repay the loan once they were established in Utah, so that others could be helped in turn. It was typical of Young's practical approach to building the kingdom of God on earth. In 1850, the territory of Utah was organized, and Brigham Young was appointed territorial governor by President Millard Fillmore. Young now held both religious and political authority over the Mormon settlements. He governed with an iron hand. He believed in order and obedience. He believed that the Mormon people had been chosen by God for a special purpose, and that purpose required discipline and sacrifice. Young established a theocracy in Utah, a government ruled by religious law. Church and state were one. Young's word was law, both spiritual and temporal. Brigham Young was a colonizer on a grand scale. He sent Mormon families to establish settlements throughout the Great Basin and beyond. He founded over 300 towns and cities. He sent colonists to San Bernardino, California, and to Las Vegas, Nevada. He sent them to southern Utah to grow cotton. He sent them to northern Utah to farm wheat. He sent them to the mountains to mine iron and coal. Young believed in self-sufficiency. He wanted the Mormon people to be independent of the outside world, to produce everything they needed themselves. He encouraged the development of industries and crafts. He established a system of cooperative stores. But Brigham Young could not escape the conflicts that had plagued the Mormons in Missouri and Illinois. The practice of plural marriage, which Joseph Smith had introduced and which Young defended and practiced openly, made the Mormons objects of scandal and outrage in the rest of America. Young himself married dozens of women. The exact number is disputed, but it was at least 55. He fathered 57 children. Young defended plural marriage as a commandment from God, revealed to Joseph Smith. He said it was a higher law, a test of faith and obedience. Critics called it barbaric and immoral. They compared the Mormons to the polygamous societies of the Middle East and Africa. The federal government began to take action against the Mormon practice of plural marriage. In 1856, the Republican Party platform called for the elimination of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. After the Civil War, the government turned its attention to Utah. Congress passed laws making plural marriage illegal. Federal judges and marshals were sent to Utah to enforce these laws. Brigham Young was indicted for polygamy, though he was never brought to trial. The conflict between the Mormon Church and the federal government reached its peak in 1857 when President James Buchanan, responding to reports of Mormon rebellion and lawlessness, sent the United States Army to Utah to replace Brigham Young as territorial governor and to enforce federal authority. Young saw this as an invasion. He declared martial law and prepared to resist. He called the Mormon settlers in outlying areas to abandon their homes and retreat to Salt Lake City. He sent militia units to harass the approaching army, burning supply wagons and driving off cattle. He threatened to burn Salt Lake City to the ground rather than surrender it to federal troops. The Utah War, as it came to be called, never resulted in actual battle. Negotiations were conducted, and a peaceful resolution was reached. The army entered Salt Lake City and established a post, but Brigham Young remained the de facto leader of the Mormon people. The episode demonstrated Young's determination to defend Mormon autonomy and his willingness to use force if necessary. It also demonstrated his pragmatism. When he saw that armed resistance would be futile, he negotiated. The darkest episode of Brigham Young's leadership occurred during this period of tension with the federal government. In September 1857, a wagon train of emigrants from Arkansas and Missouri was passing through southern Utah on its way to California. At a place called Mountain Meadows, the wagon train was attacked by Mormon militiamen and their Native American allies. After a 5-day siege, the Mormons approached under a flag of truce and promised the emigrants safe passage if they would lay down their weapons. The emigrants agreed. But once they were disarmed and separated, the Mormons and their allies massacred them. 120 men, women, and children were killed. Only small children too young to tell what had happened were spared. The Mountain Meadows massacre remains one of the most controversial events in Mormon history. The question of Brigham Young's involvement has never been definitively answered. Young denied ordering the massacre. He claimed that local leaders acted without his knowledge or approval. But Young was known for his tight control over Mormon settlements and his extensive network of communication. Some historians believe he must have known and approved. Others believe that local leaders, caught up in the war fever and afraid that the emigrants were spies or enemies, acted on their own initiative. Young certainly tried to cover up the massacre afterward. For years, the Mormons blamed the attack entirely on Native Americans. Only one man, John D. Lee, was eventually executed for the crime, 20 years after the event. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, Brigham Young continued to lead the Mormon Church and to develop the Utah Territory. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, linking Utah to the rest of the nation. Young had mixed feelings about the railroad. He understood that it would bring prosperity and growth, but he also feared that it would bring outside influences that would corrupt the Mormon people. He was right on both counts. The railroad brought miners and merchants and gamblers and prostitutes. It brought federal officials and journalists. It made it impossible for the Mormons to remain isolated. Young adapted to the changing circumstances. He encouraged Mormon businesses to compete with the Gentile businesses that were establishing themselves in Salt Lake City. He continued to preach self-sufficiency and cooperation. He established the Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, a church-owned department store that was meant to keep Mormon money within the Mormon community. He continued to defend plural marriage even as the federal government increased its pressure on the church to abandon the practice. Brigham Young was a complex and contradictory figure. He was a devoted religious leader who believed he was doing God's work, but he was also an authoritarian who demanded absolute obedience. He was a visionary colonizer who transformed a desert into a thriving society, but he was also complicit in violence and persecution. He was a practical man who understood economics and organization, but he was also a believer in prophecy and revelation. He preached cooperation and community, but he also accumulated great personal wealth. He owned businesses and property. He lived in a grand house called the Beehive House in Salt Lake City. Young's health began to decline in his 70s. He suffered from rheumatism and other ailments. But he continued to preach and to govern the church until the very end. On August 29, 1877, at the age of 76, Brigham Young died in Salt Lake City. His last words were reportedly "Joseph, Joseph, Joseph," calling out to his beloved prophet and friend. Young was buried in a simple grave in Salt Lake City, in accordance with his wishes. Brigham Young's legacy is deeply contested. To faithful Mormons, he was a prophet and a colonizer, a man who saved the Mormon people from destruction and led them to safety. He established the church on a firm foundation and ensured its survival. He was a practical visionary who built a kingdom in the desert. To critics, Young was a theocratic dictator who practiced polygamy, who may have been complicit in massacre, who oppressed dissenters and ruled through fear. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Young was a man of his time, shaped by the religious enthusiasms and the frontier violence of 19th-century America. He was a survivor who would do whatever was necessary to protect his people. He was a believer who thought he was building the kingdom of God on earth. When he died, he left behind a church that would grow to millions of members worldwide, and a state that would eventually join the Union and prosper. Brigham Young was, even in death, the colonizing prophet who led his people through the wilderness to their promised land. Joseph Smith was a New England farm boy and a visionary prophet who became the founder of a new American religion. Joseph Smith, the first prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was born in Sharon, Vermont on December 23, 1805. He came from a humble farming family. He had a charismatic presence. Smith's family struggled with poverty throughout his childhood. He received limited formal education, attending school sporadically as his family moved frequently in search of better opportunities. Then in 1816, his family relocated to Palmyra, New York, settling in an area that would become known as the Burned-Over District due to the intense religious fervor that swept through the region. The 11-year-old Smith found himself in the midst of a spiritual awakening that was transforming western New York. Joseph Smith was the son of farmers who witnessed the religious tumult of his era. He had a family that believed in visions and divine intervention. In 1820, when religious revivals were consuming the Palmyra area, Smith experienced what he would later call the first vision. America felt that it was a new Israel, a promised land where God would restore true Christianity, and young Joseph Smith believed he had been chosen for that divine purpose. Joseph Smith was not a trained theologian or an educated minister like the established clergy who dominated American Protestantism. He was a more unlikely prophet, a teenage boy claiming direct communication with God. In the spring of 1820, Smith was troubled by the competing claims of different churches. He went into a grove of trees near his family's farm to pray for guidance. According to his account, God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him in a pillar of light, telling him that all existing churches had strayed from the truth and that he should join none of them. This vision would become the founding event of what would grow into a new religious movement. But Smith kept this experience largely private for several years, sharing it only with family members and close associates. 3 years later, in September 1823, Smith reported another supernatural experience. He claimed that an angel named Moroni appeared to him in his bedroom, telling him about an ancient record written on golden plates buried in a nearby hill. These plates, Moroni explained, contained the religious history of ancient peoples who had inhabited the Americas. The angel appeared to Smith multiple times, instructing him that he would eventually be allowed to retrieve the plates and translate them. Smith was literally the young man who claimed divine messengers were preparing him for a sacred mission. In September 1827, Smith said he finally obtained the golden plates from the hill Cumorah near Palmyra. He began the work of translation, claiming to use special instruments that came with the plates, which he called the Urim and Thummim. Smith dictated the translation to scribes, including his wife Emma and a local farmer named Martin Harris, while the plates were hidden from view, often concealed behind a curtain or in another room. The translation process was unconventional and mysterious, but Smith worked steadily to produce what would become the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith married Emma Hale in January 1827, despite the objections of her father. Emma was an educated woman from a respectable family in Pennsylvania. She became Smith's devoted companion and his first scribe in the translation work. Their marriage would endure extraordinary trials and controversies. Emma stood by her husband through persecution, poverty, and constant upheaval, though she would later struggle with some of his teachings and practices. The translation of the golden plates was interrupted by setbacks and challenges. Martin Harris, who had been helping Smith, took 116 pages of the manuscript to show his skeptical wife, and the pages were lost, never to be recovered. Smith reported that he lost the ability to translate for a time as divine punishment. But eventually he resumed the work with new scribes, including a schoolteacher named Oliver Cowdery, who became one of his most important early followers. By 1829, the translation was complete. In March 1830, the Book of Mormon was published in Palmyra. The book told the story of ancient Hebrew peoples who had migrated to the Americas around 600 BC, establishing civilizations and receiving visits from Jesus Christ after his resurrection. It presented itself as another testament of Jesus Christ, a companion scripture to the Bible. The book was controversial from the moment it appeared. Critics called it a fraud and a fabrication. Supporters hailed it as a new revelation from God. The Book of Mormon would become the keystone of a new faith. On April 6, 1830, Joseph Smith formally organized the Church of Christ, later renamed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in Fayette, New York. The church began with just 6 official members, but it would grow rapidly. Smith was not just the founder but the prophet, seer, and revelator of this new religious movement. He claimed continuing revelation from God, receiving divine communications that guided the church's doctrine and organization. This concept of ongoing revelation set the Latter-day Saints apart from traditional Christianity. The early church faced immediate opposition. Smith and his followers were accused of being deluded fanatics. Neighbors in New York viewed them with suspicion and hostility. The Latter-day Saints were different. They challenged established religious authority, they claimed new scripture, and they gathered together in tight-knit communities that seemed exclusive and strange to outsiders. Within months of the church's founding, Smith began receiving revelations directing the saints to gather in Ohio. In 1831, Smith and many of his followers relocated to Kirtland, Ohio, establishing their first significant community. In Kirtland, the church grew dramatically. Smith established a communal economic system called the Law of Consecration, where members were asked to deed their property to the church. He organized the church's leadership structure, establishing a first presidency and a quorum of the 12 apostles. He received revelations that were compiled into what became the Doctrine and Covenants, another book of scripture for the Latter-day Saints. Smith was building not just a church but a comprehensive religious society with its own economic, political, and social systems. Joseph Smith was a visionary who saw his mission as restoring primitive Christianity. He believed that the original church established by Jesus Christ had been corrupted over centuries and that he was called to restore it in its fullness. Smith introduced practices and doctrines that were radical for his time. He taught that God had a physical body, that humans could become like God, that there were multiple heavens with different degrees of glory, and that families could be sealed together for eternity. These theological innovations distinguished Mormonism from traditional Protestant Christianity. In 1833, while still leading the church from Kirtland, Smith sent missionaries to establish a settlement in Jackson County, Missouri, which he identified through revelation as the location of the Garden of Eden and the future site of Zion, a New Jerusalem. But the Missouri settlers faced violent opposition from their neighbors. The Latter-day Saints were driven from Jackson County by mobs who burned their homes and threatened their lives. The Saints relocated to other parts of Missouri, but the conflict only intensified. Missouri became a battleground between the Latter-day Saints and their opponents. In Kirtland, Smith oversaw the construction of the first Latter-day Saint temple, completed in 1836. The Kirtland Temple was the site of significant spiritual experiences for early church members, including reports of visions, angelic visitations, and an outpouring of spiritual gifts. But Kirtland also became the scene of financial disaster. Smith and church leaders established a bank called the Kirtland Safety Society, but it failed during the Panic of 1837, leaving many church members financially ruined. Dissenters blamed Smith for the losses, and some left the church. Smith faced lawsuits and threats of violence. By 1838, Smith fled Kirtland and joined the main body of saints in Missouri. But Missouri proved even more dangerous than Ohio. Conflicts between Latter-day Saints and other Missouri settlers escalated into what became known as the 1838 Mormon War. There were armed skirmishes, raids, and massacres on both sides. Governor Lilburn Boggs issued an extermination order declaring that Mormons must be driven from the state or exterminated. Smith and other church leaders were arrested and imprisoned on charges of treason. Smith spent months in Liberty Jail under harsh conditions, but he continued to lead the church through letters and revelation sent to his followers. While Smith was imprisoned, the Latter-day Saints were forced to flee Missouri in the dead of winter. Thousands of men, women, and children crossed the frozen Mississippi River into Illinois, seeking refuge. The state of Illinois welcomed them, and the Saints began to establish a new city on a swampy bend of the Mississippi River. They called it Nauvoo, a Hebrew word meaning beautiful place. Smith was eventually released from jail through a change of venue and escape with the help of sympathetic guards. He joined his people in Nauvoo in 1839. Nauvoo became the crowning achievement of Joseph Smith's temporal leadership. Under his direction, the Saints drained swamps, built thousands of homes, and established businesses and industries. Within a few years, Nauvoo became one of the largest cities in Illinois, rivaling Chicago in population. Smith was not only the prophet but also the mayor, the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, a militia of several thousand men, and the chief judge. He wielded enormous religious, political, and military power in Nauvoo. The city was virtually a theocracy with Smith at its head. In Nauvoo, Smith introduced his most controversial teachings. He began to teach a doctrine he called plural marriage, or polygamy, to his inner circle of church leaders. Smith claimed that God had commanded the practice through revelation, restoring a principle practiced by Old Testament prophets like Abraham. But plural marriage was illegal under American law and deeply offensive to 19th-century American sensibilities. Smith practiced plural marriage himself, eventually marrying more than 30 women, though the exact number remains disputed by historians. Some of these marriages were to young women, others to women who were already married to other men in what were called polyandrous unions. Joseph Smith kept plural marriage secret from most church members and from the public. Only a select group of trusted leaders and their families were introduced to the practice. But secrets in a close-knit community are difficult to keep. Rumors of polygamy began to circulate, causing scandal and internal dissent. Some church members who learned of the practice were shocked and left the church. Others accepted it as a divine commandment, however difficult. Emma Smith struggled deeply with plural marriage, alternately accepting and rejecting the practice, causing strain in her marriage to Joseph. In Nauvoo, Smith also introduced temple ordinances that became central to Latter-day Saint worship. He taught that special ceremonies performed in temples could seal families together for eternity and prepare individuals to return to God's presence. The Nauvoo Temple, begun in 1841, was a magnificent structure that dominated the city's landscape. Smith poured enormous resources into its construction, even as the church faced financial pressures. The temple represented Smith's vision of a restored Christianity with sacred rituals that echoed ancient temple worship. Joseph Smith's ambitions extended beyond religion into politics. In 1844, he announced his candidacy for President of the United States. His platform included the abolition of slavery through compensated emancipation, prison reform, the annexation of Texas and Oregon, and the establishment of a national bank. Smith sent missionaries throughout the country to campaign for him. His presidential campaign was audacious and unlikely to succeed, but it demonstrated Smith's belief that the kingdom of God should influence American politics and society. Smith was literally the prophet who believed he could reshape the American Republic. But opposition to Smith and the Latter-day Saints was growing. Non-Mormon neighbors in Illinois became alarmed by Nauvoo's size and power. They feared that the Latter-day Saints voted as a bloc under Smith's direction, giving them disproportionate political influence. Rumors of polygamy scandalized outsiders. Former church members who had become dissenters began to speak out against Smith, accusing him of tyranny and immorality. In June 1844, dissenters in Nauvoo established a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor to publicize their grievances against Smith and church leadership. The Nauvoo Expositor published only one issue, but that issue was explosive. It accused Smith of practicing polygamy, of teaching false doctrines, and of wielding dictatorial power. Smith, acting in his capacity as mayor, convened the Nauvoo City Council, which declared the newspaper a public nuisance. Smith ordered the city marshal to destroy the printing press and burn all copies of the newspaper. This action, though possibly legal under the broad interpretation of nuisance laws at the time, was seen by outsiders as a violation of freedom of the press and proof of Smith's tyranny. The destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor ignited a firestorm of opposition. Anti-Mormon mobs began to gather in surrounding towns. Illinois Governor Thomas Ford demanded that Smith and others responsible for destroying the press submit to arrest and trial. Smith initially considered fleeing west with his brother Hiram and other leaders, even beginning to cross the Mississippi River. But he was persuaded to return and face the charges, believing that his surrender would prevent violence against the Saints in Nauvoo. On June 24, 1844, Smith and his brother Hiram surrendered to authorities in Carthage, the county seat. Smith and Hiram were charged with inciting a riot and later with treason, a charge that was legally dubious but politically convenient. They were held in the Carthage jail while awaiting trial. Governor Ford promised them protection, but the governor's assurances proved empty. On June 27, 1844, a mob of men with painted faces stormed the jail. They rushed up the stairs to the room where Smith and his companions were held. Shots were fired through the door. Hiram Smith was struck and killed instantly. Joseph Smith fought back, firing a small pistol that had been smuggled to him, wounding some of the attackers. Joseph Smith ran to the window and attempted to escape or perhaps to draw the mob's fire away from his companions. He was shot multiple times from the doorway and from outside the jail. He fell from the second-story window and landed on the ground below. The mob surrounded his body and shot him again to ensure he was dead. Joseph Smith died at approximately 5 p.m. on June 27, 1844. He was 38 years old. His brother Hiram, who was 44, died alongside him. Two other men in the jail, John Taylor and Willard Richards, survived, though Taylor was severely wounded. The assassination of Joseph Smith shocked the Latter-day Saints and sent the church into crisis. Smith had been the prophet, the sole source of revelation and authority for the church. He had not clearly designated a successor. Multiple leaders claimed the right to lead the church. The largest group of saints eventually followed Brigham Young, the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who led them west to the Salt Lake Valley in Utah. Other groups followed different leaders, forming separate denominations that also claimed to be the continuation of Smith's church. Joseph Smith's legacy is complex and controversial. To his followers, he was a prophet of God who restored true Christianity and revealed sacred truths. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints grew from the small band Smith organized in 1830 to become a global religion with millions of members. The Book of Mormon has been translated into dozens of languages and distributed throughout the world. Latter-day Saints view Smith as a martyr who sealed his testimony with his blood. To his critics, Joseph Smith was a charlatan and a fraud who invented a religion for personal gain and power. They point to the lack of archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon's claims about ancient American civilizations, to the contradictions and revisions in Smith's revelations, and to controversial practices like polygamy. They see Smith as a talented storyteller and manipulator who exploited the religious enthusiasm of his era. The debate over Joseph Smith's character and claims continues to this day. What is undeniable is Joseph Smith's impact on American religious history. He founded a new religious tradition that has endured and grown for nearly 2 centuries. He produced volumes of scripture and revelation that shaped the beliefs of millions. He established communities and institutions that left lasting marks on the American landscape. He challenged conventional Christianity with radical theological innovations. Whether prophet or pretender, Joseph Smith was one of the most influential religious figures in American history. Joseph Smith lived during a time of tremendous religious ferment in America. The Second Great Awakening was sweeping through the young nation, and new religious movements were emerging everywhere. Smith was part of this broader pattern, but he was also unique. Unlike other religious innovators of his era, Smith claimed to restore ancient Christianity rather than reform existing churches. He produced new scripture rather than simply reinterpreting the Bible. He built a comprehensive religious society rather than just a congregation of believers. Smith's theology was distinctive and evolving. He taught that God the Father had once been a man who progressed to become God, and that humans could follow the same path to divinity. He taught that there were multiple gods, that matter was eternal, and that intelligence or spirit was co-eternal with God. He taught that salvation required both faith and works, grace and ordinances. He taught that families could be bound together forever through temple ceremonies. These doctrines set Mormonism apart from traditional Christian orthodoxy and continue to distinguish the Latter-day Saint faith. Joseph Smith was also a product of his time and place. He grew up in an America that was expanding westward, that believed in manifest destiny, that was experimenting with utopian communities and social reform. His visions of ancient American civilizations reflected the widespread fascination with the mysterious earthen mounds found throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. His communal economic experiments echoed other communitarian movements of the era. His combination of religious and political authority reflected the ambiguity about the separation of church and state in early America. The violence that Joseph Smith experienced throughout his life reflected the religious intolerance and mob violence that characterized much of 19th century America. The Latter-day Saints were not the only religious group to face persecution. Catholics, Jews, and other minority faiths also experienced discrimination and violence. But the Saints faced particularly intense opposition because they were not just a religious minority but an organized community that challenged local political and economic power structures wherever they settled. They were seen as un-American, as a threat to Republican values. Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. The church he founded officially practiced polygamy from the 1850s until 1890, when Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto ending the practice under pressure from the U.S. government. Today, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints excommunicates members who practice polygamy. But fundamentalist Mormon groups that broke away from the main church continue to practice plural marriage, claiming to follow Joseph Smith's original teachings. The legacy of polygamy continues to affect how the Latter-day Saint Church is perceived. When Joseph Smith died in Carthage jail, he left behind a widow, Emma, and 4 surviving children. Emma never followed Brigham Young west to Utah. She remained in Nauvoo, eventually remarrying. She denied until her death that Joseph had practiced polygamy, protecting his reputation as she understood it. Her son, Joseph Smith III, later became the prophet of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now called the Community of Christ, which rejected polygamy and some of the doctrines taught in Nauvoo. Emma's complicated relationship with her husband's legacy reflects the divisions that Smith's teachings created. Joseph Smith was even in death a polarizing figure who inspired both devotion and denunciation. He was a religious genius or a religious fraud, depending on one's perspective. He was a prophet who spoke with God or a storyteller who invented divine encounters. He was a martyr who died for his faith or a demagogue who brought destruction on himself and his followers. The truth about Joseph Smith may lie somewhere in the complexity between these extremes, in the recognition that he was a human being with both remarkable gifts and serious flaws, who created something that outlasted him and continues to shape lives today.